Hello, Eric Jonathan Sheptock coming at you. Well, as always, I have a lot on my mind. And I decided that it's high time for me to explain to people my greatest sorrow. It is my greatest sorrow in life. But being the deep thinker that I am, I have quite a bit to say, so I wrote a few notes down so I can run through this thing with some degree of speed and fluidity here. So, my greatest sorrow. Well, first of all, if you're keeping up with the news, then you may have heard that there have been a lot of fires, a lot of drought, a lot of extreme heat, a lot of flooding. They've been connected to global warming. Been a lot of deaths in the past couple of weeks because of these different events in different parts of the world. And that's not my greatest sorrow. Then again, in DC as well as in New Orleans, in the past couple of weeks, we've had these, shall I call them spray shootings, where guys just ride up to a location where there are a lot of people and they just spray bullets all over the place. Here in DC, a 10-year-old girl was killed when they sprayed bullets at a large party of people. In New Orleans, 3 people were killed and 7 people were hurt on Saturday night when some guys just walked up or drove up and sprayed the entire crowd. But no, that's not even among my greatest sorrows. Then, of course, there are the deaths from this K2 or Spice or Zorro or Bizarro, or whatever you want to call this synthetic marijuana. In D.C., I found an article from a couple weeks ago that said there had been 4 deaths from this synthetic marijuana. I know that since then there has been at least 1 more death here in D.C. And many of those who are using this stuff are homeless people, the people for whom I advocate for a solution to their shared plight. But even that's not among my greatest sorrows. A close friend and fellow advocate recently said to me after a friend of his died from K2 this past Thursday. Well, the person died on Thursday, and I spoke to this friend on Saturday, and he said to me that he just feels like a lot of homeless people, a lot of drug users had just given up on themselves and on life, and that's why they're going out and they're using something that they hear is killing people. The more they hear that people are dying from it, the more they line up for it. And I said, that I thought folk were just suicidal, but then he came back and said that he just feels like they've given up. He doesn't quite categorize them as suicidal, but they just don't see a way out of their plight, and this is the one thing that just makes them feel good enough to where they can forget their troubles, at least for a short while. But none of those things are my greatest sorrow. So before I can explain to you what my greatest sorrow is, let me first tell you that a few years ago, I read an article that was the result of a study that had been done. And this study had concluded that a higher percentage of women are overweight these days because housework is not as labor intensive as it was back in the 1800s. And when I read that article, I asked, why would anybody even do such a study? Because even if you're right, even if your conclusion is correct, and I'm not saying that it is or that it isn't, but the information's not going to be well received. Do you honestly think that we're going to go back to using washboards and buckets to wash our clothes? I don't think so. So, that study was pointless for anyone to even do, because even if you found out that moral labor intensive housework would help women keep the weight off, then there's nothing you can do with that information, and the women are just going to categorize you, and some men are going to categorize you as male chauvinist pigs and whatever else you want to throw out there. So before you even do a study, before you even do an experiment, you have to ask yourself, how will this information be received if we conclude such and such? You know, and that goes right into the whole global warming thing, because we've been warned about global warming for 30 years, and some have taken to calling it climate change. But whatever term you choose to use, the information has been rejected primarily by Republicans. They reject science because if we're honest about science, then we have to be honest that some businesses, such as the oil industry, are contributing largely to global warming. And we have these oil tycoons like the Bush family, where they become president. Okay, and so they want to disregard the science because of their motivations, because that's where they make their money. Okay, so there's that issue. But that kind of goes into what my greatest sorrow is. My greatest sorrow is how people think. So going back to this whole washboard study, as I call it, saying that more women are overweight because they're not using washboards and buckets to wash their clothes. Now, as idiotic as it was to do that study, it still speaks to another issue, which is, when we learn this or that truth, what are we going to do with the information? There are times that the findings are important for us to pay attention to, but we still don't pay attention to them. And people just kind of choose what they want to believe, irrespective of where the evidence points. And you see, everything you do starts with a thought. So the worst activities, the worst actions by people are the result of bad thinking. So I was recently talking with some guys about a news item. There was a recent news item about Emmett Till. Emmett Till was killed back in the 1950s. He was a black man killed by some white racists. And in this news item, they were saying that the two men who killed him were acquitted. And after they were acquitted, they actually bragged about having killed him. And so I was saying to some guys who saw that news piece with me that, hey, you know, that's really terrible that after you kill somebody, you get acquitted, then you can brag about the murder and you can't be tried for it, and you can't be put in prison for it, and you can't be put to death for it. And these guys said to me, oh, but that would be double jeopardy. And I'm like, no shit, Sherlock. I know about double jeopardy. If there's one law that I am aware of, that is it. But these guys were kind of getting on me like, Eric, you ought to know better. But my whole point was, I understand that law. But you got to think outside the box. You're so caught up in what the law is that you can't think about what it should be. People just don't think these days. About 10 years ago, I remember reading an article about a judge somewhere in D.C. Metro, Maryland, Virginia, DMV as we often call it. Here, DMV stands for two things: Department of Motor Vehicles, as well as D.C., Maryland, Virginia. And so there was a judge in the DMV about 10 years ago who was in the paper for saying that he would never again adjudicate a DUI case because the Constitution says that you're innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, whereas when the cops do a field sobriety test, you're proven guilty before you reach the court of law. And I'm thinking, well, you know, we have this technology now that allows us to gather evidence before going to court, which makes a lot of sense. And this judge is just so far behind the times and doesn't want us to use the means that we have for figuring out who is or isn't guilty of a crime, which kind of harkens back to the whole Emmett Till thing that I just mentioned. But I've thought a lot over the years about how Americans today don't think the way that the founding fathers of this nation thought. You know, they wrote down a lot of different freedoms they want us to have. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Okay, and the one freedom that they didn't write down, but which they obviously used, was the freedom to think, free thought. And I think they should have put that in the Constitution too. And they should have highlighted that as the most important freedom that you have, because these days people just don't like to think. And that kind of reminds me, because I go to church a lot. I'm a regular church attendee, and I love God. I actually love God more than Jesus, because God is more hardcore than Jesus. I think people misuse salvation, but that's another video. But I've noticed how that so many churchgoers only scratch the surface of what different scriptures mean. And when I try to go deeper and I try to, or I juxtapose different scriptures and I try to tease out the truth that lies between them, you know, people reject that. Or if I take a story where there are strong implications and I tease out those implications, they reject it and like, oh, well, it's not in writing, and I've never heard a preacher say that from the pulpit. You know, I didn't get programmed by the preacher to believe such and such, so I'm not going to accept what you're saying, Eric. And I'm like, but if you look at that verse and you really think about it, it's strongly implied, you know, ... You know, or there are some scriptures that tell you very plainly, like Isaiah 45:7, where God speaks. He says, I form light and create darkness. I make good and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Or there's Romans chapter 9, which indicates that there is predestination, that some folk are predestined to do good and others are predestined to do evil. That doesn't mean there's not a third class where that can decide, you know, whether they're going to do good or evil. But that said, Romans chapter 9 and certain other parts of the Bible indicate that there is a strong likelihood of predestination for a lot of people. It tells us in other parts of the New Testament that Judas was predestined to betray Jesus Christ. And had he not done that, I'm not sure if we'd even have salvation. But even when I muse about that, you know, people say, well, if Judas hadn't done it, then God would have gotten somebody else to do it. And it's like, well, okay, so God needed somebody to do that in order to bring in salvation, you know. And salvation is based on a necessary evil. You know, we needed for there to be people who hated Jesus Christ so that he could be crucified, so that he could satisfy God's bloodthirst, so that God would then forgive the world. But I know I'm oversimplifying the matter a bit, but be that as it may, that's something for you to think about. What else? So people won't admit to the failures of democracy. Even in lieu of Trump, we have people who voted for Trump who no longer like him. We have people who didn't vote and who now complain about Trump. And I keep telling people, look, you know, this is a failure of democracy. This is a failure of people to do critical thinking. There were people like the basket of deplorables that Hillary Clinton referred to in Appalachia who are so stupid as to say things like, he's going to make us all rich. Well, wealth doesn't work like that. Wealth works kind of like the lottery, where a person pays $1 or $2 for this or that lottery game, and then winner takes all, winner takes the millions, right? That's how that works. And in other parts of our society, We have people who work on actual jobs in corporations, and they generate a lot of income. And then the guys at the top, the few, they take a disproportionate amount of the money that was generated, and they become millionaires and billionaires. That's how wealth works. You will never get to a place where everybody is wealthy. If everybody rakes in $1 million a year, then that means one loaf of bread's going to cost you $5,000. Okay, so you get extreme inflation when everybody's making $1 million a year. So no, Trump's not gonna make us all rich. As a homeless advocate, I've talked about the failures of DC government and the motivations of DC government, how that they've been supposedly working on ending homelessness since 2004. The ICH, that is the Interagency Council on Homelessness, DC's ICH, because there are other ICHs, but they first met in June of 2006, so they were conceived in 2004, more or less, and they met in 2006, and they've been meeting ever since, and there has not been a decrease in homelessness that I feel represents the amount of work that has been put in. We had 8,253 homeless people in 2004. We had 6,904 in 2018. That's about 96 people per year that we're going down by on average. And we have more people than that working in homeless services. So it's onerous, at the very least. And so there's that. And then there are the motivations of DC government and how that different mayors, different administrations have been motivated to draw in the high earners. Some have said it outright that they have to draw in high earners in order to increase the tax base and then put more money into social services. They do Part A and then they never do Part B. So there's that. And people just don't analyze the data and tease out all these truths, and they're just not honest with themselves. And so you have some people who reject the science that's mentioned to them, and you have other people who just don't want to look at the data that's available. Even when you put it in front of them, they just don't read it. So let me see. What else? Well, that all begs the question, what can we do about it? Well, in terms of the system, in terms of governance, the way to tear down the failed system is to create the new system within it first. Even Karl Marx would have told you that you don't get the new and better system until the various components of that system exist within the older system. And that of course, is a tricky area that requires a lot of thought. And since I'm encouraging people to think, well, that's something for you to think about. So I'll help get you started there. You see, I believe that what my friend said about the homeless people and other people who use this K2 drug, even though it's killing people, that deep down inside, they want a completely different system. I connect that to why many of the homeless are not getting jobs. You see, it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they want a handout. It's because they realize that their reality with their work history, with their skill set, is that they're not wanted by employers, or they may realize that their skill set limits them to making no more than about $15 or even $20 an hour in a place where you have to make $35, $44 an hour to pay the rent for that area. And yes, people, that is reality here in DC. There are some rentals that require that you make about $44 an hour because you work about 2,000 hours a year. And if you don't make $88,000, then you can't pay $2,200 a month for a rental. And there are rentals that cost that much and more in DC. And so many of the homeless just realize what their reality is. And it's like, why would I get up and go out and put all this effort into getting a job that's not going to pay the rent? The minimum wage is $13.25, but you have to make $35, $44 an hour. I mean, the way averages work, for every place where you have to make $44 an hour, there may be another place where $35 an hour is good enough. But if you're not mathematically inclined, I'm not going to teach you how math works right now. But anyway, if it takes about 3 times the minimum wage and at least 2 times what the person can ever hope to earn with their skill set and what have you, then they're not going to start a journey that they can't finish. Many of the homeless actually do work, but they still can't pay rent. But that said, I think that many of the people who have just given up, whether they've given up to the extent that they're doing drugs that they heard are killing people, or they've given up to the extent that they've just accepted that they're going to spend the rest of their life in a shelter, whatever the degree to which they've given up, they're hoping for a different and better system that's based on a different set of values and a different way of thinking. Maybe they're hoping for government officials who, like Obama said some years ago, will do the math. And before you can hope for people to live right, you have to ensure that the environment that they're in is conducive to them living right. If it's not possible, if the math doesn't work out, then there's no point in starting that journey when living right means that you have to work and hold your own. Because when you work and your check doesn't buy your own, then you can't hold your own, quite obviously. But I think that that's just emblematic of a much different system, a much different set of values, a much different belief system that people are hoping for. And people are just kind of in their own world, if you will. They're kind of thinking that their sorrow is just their sorrow and not realizing that there's a much bigger group of people who have the same concern, but it hasn't been articulated by a charismatic person who can pull everybody together. And so that kind of leads right into my final points here. So, like I think I said earlier, or I meant to say anyway, I do plan to run for DC mayor. Now, like Donald Trump, I may be a long shot candidate, and who knows, like Donald Trump, I might actually win. But the next 9 days will determine whether or not I even get on the ballot. So I would encourage people to try to understand how government works, and I would make this the first lesson for those of you who live in DC anyway. So by August 8th, I need to get 3,000 signatures, petition signatures, in order to get on the ballot. So I need about 40 people who will each invest 6 hours of work to getting some signatures for me. And I'm going to try to get 4,000 signatures, because sometimes signatures are disqualified. Either they're illegible or the person doesn't actually live in DC, but they signed it anyway, even though they were told not to if they don't live here, or they're not a registered voter. And so that said, we need to get more than just the 3,000 in lieu of the fact that some signatures might be disqualified. Now, if 40 people will each come out and put in 6 hours, even 10 or 12 hours, then we can get that many signatures, and we can do it in a single day. I have 9 days left. But with that 1 day's worth of work, we can make this happen. But a lot of people would say, hey, you don't seem like the mayoral type. I'm not sure I'd want to vote for you, But first things first, people. You don't have to vote for me on November 6th. But if you want your concerns to be brought to the political debate, then you need to get me on the ballot. So you can sign the petition between now and the morning of August 8th so that I can turn them in before close of business on August 8th. And then you can vote against me in November if you're not impressed with what I say on the campaign trail. But that's your first little lesson in terms of how government works. Just signing a petition to get somebody on the ballot is not committing to voting that person into office. Okay, so let me see. And as my final point, I'll say this. If you don't want to think, then you need leaders to think for you. I encourage you to be a free thinker. I encourage you to think the way that the founding fathers of this country thought. But if you don't want to think, then you create the need for government to think for you. And when it comes to that issue, we can sum up the worst case scenario in a single word: Trump.